Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées, or Pensées. I might end up saying it that way. I don't know. You guys have been pressuring me pretty hard. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. As I always do in the podcast, I have to promote myself a little bit. If you guys like this podcast, please become a Patreon supporter. You can find the link in the description. Other ways you can support me: subscribe to the channel. That'd be huge. Leave a comment. Let me know what you guys think. I'd love to hear from you. I love continually hearing from you guys in the comments. And then a supererogatory act would be going over to Apple Podcasts, leaving me a 5-star review and a good comment. That'd be huge. Today we have another special guest, as always, or as most always. We're going to be talking with Dr. Jc Beall about his book, The Contradictory Christ. There we go. And I want to go in deep, and I'm really scared about this one. As I've told him, he's pretty convincing. It's kind of scary. So without further ado, let's just pull him in. Dr. Beall, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks.
I first heard of you. Unfortunately, this was the first time I heard of you, but I think it was last year or a year and a half ago. I was in Dr. Tom McCall's PhD class on Trinity and Atonement, and he had mentioned he's going to Notre Dame and he's going to be talking about some weird contradictory Christ stuff. And he came back, and I saw a picture on Facebook of some of the work on the board, and I didn't understand any of it. And I was just like, man, that's crazy. Okay, I'll just put that to the side. And then you've been taking the internet world by storm. It's so intriguing. And now, like, after I've read it and got into the book more and listened to some of your podcast episodes you've been on, it's freaking me out, man. It's pulling me in. But before we get into the contradictory Christology type stuff, I wanted to ask you some logic questions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how did you end up? Do you call yourself a logician, or you how do you describe yourself as a philosopher?
So, I mean, in general, I think people are what they do, really. I do logic. I do philosophy of logic, and I've always had a very real interest in theology, but only recently I've been doing analytic theology. But yeah, I mean, if you talk with people in philosophy and you mention my name, they'll say logician, philosopher of logic. But yeah, so I don't really, I don't really call myself much. I just do what I do, and I let other people come up with what they want to call me.
Well, that's cool, because I do want to call you a logician. It's just fun to say. You're a logician. That's fantastic. You'd mentioned, I heard in a different conversation that you grew up in the Reformed tradition. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Dutch Reformed or American Reformed, or?
I mean, it was right when, I forget all the splits. I mean, one thing that frustrates me about the Christian church generally, but once the Protestants split off, just the always splitting more and more on things that it's like, hey, look, everyone's supposed to be following Christ. That's supposed to be the big common point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you would think that Christ had the foreknowledge to say, like, oh, and by the way, don't ever stick with people who are going to say this or that. I mean, it drives me crazy. But yeah, I mean, theology early on, Calvin, Berkhoff, and that crowd, although those were in my dad's library. He wasn't in any way an academic, but we had those in the library, and I really got into those and read them. I probably didn't understand very much of any of it, but I also very much liked, I'd go to used bookstores, and I got a book by Barth and one by Tillich and one by, Bonhoeffer's letters were really powerful. But yeah, in terms of the theology itself, it's just very much in the in some ways in the what's sometimes called the Princeton tradition. But
Okay, do you still find yourself in that stream?
yeah, I mean it. So part of my work now is to really try to see the extent to which that stream and my considered views overlap. And
Yeah.
I think it's, so I take the, I think of Orthodox, this term is used so many different ways. So I tend to think that sort of Orthodox Christian theology, is at least up through the Council of Chalcedon 451, where it's sort of stamped the Christology and Trinitarian doctrines. These are the core distinctive doctrines by my lights of Christian theism versus other kinds of theism. And, when it comes down to a lot of other detailed questions, I don't think I've ever held a position. And I just want to get the main doctrines. I want to understand those and get them right. And then all the other stuff hopefully will come out of that.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, so that kind of sets up my next question. How'd you become a logician? It doesn't seem like a supernatural path for a lot of people, and doesn't seem like there's a ton of you guys out there. How'd you become one?
That's right. Well, well, look, I mean, I was always, I had some talent mathematically. I had some talent philosophically. I find a lot of philosophy very difficult. And, despite my best efforts, I'm not the most patient person. And so, a person will raise a philosophical question and, it's like, well, can you be a little bit more precise? And, some of philosophy is an attempt to get precise about the question we're asking.
Mm-hmm.
But there are different ways that process can go.
Yeah.
And, my natural way is to try to understand the key terminology that's being used to voice the question or voice the issue or voice the thesis, and then try to understand how that's to be understood. This is just natural to me. And when I started taking logic, I found that very natural. My first sort of exposure to sort of what you might call deductive thinking or something, or logical thinking, was in Euclidean geometry. And I actually kept these journals that I no longer have, and I really, really wish I did, just out of mere curiosity. But Euclid's geometry just struck me as so natural that when I would keep journals and write different things down, they all sort of would take this sort of form of like trying to state as precisely and concisely the various, axioms of the position, or, what are the axioms, what are the key terms. And so that's been with me for a long time.
Yeah.
And basically, that's what sort of logic does, broadly construed.
Well, you've done that in this book, I think. Did you do that intentionally? Because it's very clear, like all your positions, it's just, this is what I believe, this is what I believe, this is what I believe, and you're not hiding really anything.
Right. I actually think that that's the way philosophy should be done, period. And I think it's the way certainly analytic theology should be done. I think it's the way, look, if you're pursuing a truth theory, then, what is it?
Yeah.
And, you shouldn't sort of state it and leave obvious questions around.
Yeah.
And if you say, here's basically the theory, but I realize there are these questions and I don't have answers, that's one thing.
Sure.
But to state it when there are obvious questions without, clarifying. That to me is just not a fruitful way of proceeding.
Yeah, I've it's actually, that is a little bit scary to lay out. I've done it. I've noticed that I did it actually reading your work. I was like, I don't always do this in my papers. And maybe I do it subconsciously or even a little bit consciously to hide my position a little bit. It's a less clear target for you to attack.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, in philosophy and some strands of theology, a lot of it is seen as sort of trying to maintain a position. But, if you step back and say, but look, the position itself isn't crystal clear.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. But even where it is crystal clear, you should welcome attacks in the following sense. Maybe attack is the wrong word, but you should welcome attempts to knock over your position. Right. I mean, if your position can't take absolute, sincere, deep scrutiny, well, is it really worth holding? This has always naturally been my view, and I encourage everyone, my colleagues, my students, friends, everyone. Look, if it's one thing if you're just out playing around or you're trying to entertain or win a debate, okay, do whatever you want. But if you're trying to, pursue truth and try to construct a true theory, if that's the goal, no matter how far you might still remain from it, but if that's the goal, then you should be excited and honored by people who try to show problems with the theory, because how else are you going to figure out whether it really stands up?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point, and it's encouraging and challenging for me as well. I've even noticed it in analytic circles as well. Oftentimes I consider myself maybe in the analytic tradition, but we blast those continental folks for using all their flowery language. But a lot of times, analytic philosophers will add unnecessary operators when they don't need them, and they're still also likewise hiding their position. And I've seen that as well, where I did appreciate how clearly you wrote. There's some operators in there because you have to get to that stuff, but you didn't extend them beyond what was necessary, and I thought that was really helpful.
Good. I'm really pleased to hear that.
Yeah. So getting back to some logic, like specifically, where do you find logic? Where is it? What discipline is it under? Is it its own discipline, or is it a subcategory of metaphysics or epistemology? Where do we find that?
It's definitely not a subcategory of epistemology. Okay. So make sure that I answer your question, but okay. But this is an important point. So for a long time, people would think of logic as good reasoning, but this was, you sort of know what they mean. They mean like, I'm pointing to this as a reason for that. So I'm pointing to that as something that is what? Well, something that follows from this, right? Or is entailed by this, and so on. So that, they talk about reasoning, but in the end, it's a dangerous conflation of something that's entirely empirical with some normative aspects, the question of what it is to, reason well and all that. Yeah. And then there's a question of logical entailment. And what is that? Or logical implication or logical consequence. I'll just use these synonymously here. I think these are very different things. And, people often think that epistemology, you have to sort of like you'd think that logic is sort of a sub-discipline of epistemology, because after all, epistemology is how we know and this sort of stuff. And you would think, well, logic's a big part of that, how you get to know. But no, it's a part of it, but these are very different things. So there's a philosopher, Gilbert Harman, who actually, for what it's worth, is in some ways held positions that are similar to some of the positions that have been popular in Protestant theology. I mean, he would never put it that way himself, but if you look, he's like always sort of anti-evidentialist and all this. But he pointed out long ago in a book called Change in View that look, a theory of reasoning is one thing, a theory of logic is very different. And one big different thing is that logic itself, logical entailment, is what logicians call monotonic. And this just means that if you start with a logically valid argument from A to B, you can add whatever you want to the premise that adds C, then the argument from C, A together logically validly gives you B. Now add D. That's monotonicity. You can expand that way. But giving a good reason for, or having a good reason to accept, or having a good reason to reject, this is not monotonic at all. This is all over the place. You could have, an example I've used elsewhere is the final exam draws from, say, 100 questions, and you have mastered those questions. You've perfected the answers. You have these down, and you've practiced and practiced and practiced, and because you've aced them in every one of the many practice exams, that gives you good reason to accept that you'll do well on the final.
Yeah.
But now add to the premise set, beyond you've aced every practice exam and the final draws from those, now add to the premise set that your calendar's messed up and the final already took place last week.
Yeah.
Well, that now you no longer have good reason to think you'll do well in the final. So, having good reason to accept or reject something is very different. It's a messy thing. I don't think we'll ever have clean-cut rules for that.
Yeah.
But logic is very different. It's a sort of, logically valid or not, and it's fairly simple to define and so on.
Yeah. So logic is monotonic. Is epistemology, would you say like polytonic or something?
Well, yeah. So it would depend on the subdiscipline of epistemology, whether, if we're thinking of rational belief revision, acceptance, rejection behavior as a subdiscipline of epistemology, then the relations involved there are very much non-monotonic. But in as much as logical entailment and other relations like this play some role in epistemology, then there's some monotonicity that's relevant. But I don't think so. Unlike the relation of logical consequence, epistemology itself isn't just a simple relation, and you can ask sensibly whether it's monotonic or not. As a discipline, it's all over the place.
Sure.
But actually, you would ask me,
where does it fit?
Where does it fit? Yeah. Well, so rather than sort of go into try to, I will if you want me to, but there's a paper I wrote with John Burgess at Princeton, a very well-known logician and philosopher of mathematics and philosophy of logic. And I think this was for Oxford Scholarship Online for their entry on logic. And And that's available. We had to truncate it to fit their whatever they wanted for that. But a fuller version is available on my website. Just look for Logic under articles, and it's with John P. Burgess. And that basically just gives you a sketch of the field of logic. So normally logic these days is broken up into philosophical logic and mathematical logic. Both are very mathematical in a lot of ways, but mathematical logic is a field within mathematics. And it's usually broken up into 4 subfields: model theory, recursion theory, set theory, and proof theory. And those are all, you'd really have to become expert in that mathematics to engage with those. They're just, if a person's doing proof theory or model theory or recursion theory, they're simply proving theorems about open problems in those mathematics. But philosophical logic is a bit different. It's still exceptionally technical. If you're looking just at, let me say, for lack of a better word, the mathematical parts of the logic in question, but philosophical logic usually breaks up into things that, so-called modal logic, so-called deontic logic, so-called non-monotonic logic. Despite what I just said, this is a tag. I think it's unfortunate terminology, and I can explain that if you want. But
is that fuzzy? Does fuzzy logic fit in there?
Fuzzy logic would be in that. Yeah, that's just a sort of many valued. Can be done different ways, but and intuitionist logic. This is a kind of logic that's supposed to be tailor-made for certain conceptions of truth in mathematics. But philosophical logic is distinct, very distinct from the philosophy of logic and distinct from the history of logic. It's not to say it's unrelated to either. It's deeply related to both. But it is, so when you're doing philosophical logic, you're defining you're defining a relation of, I'm trying to be as neutral as possible. You're defining a relation of sort of a sort of deductive like relation. What follows from what, and if you're coming up with a new philosophical logic, generally you're inspired by some philosophical problem, or you've been thinking, here's the way it has to work, and then you define this up, and sorry, without it's too difficult without like a whiteboard. I was just about to spill into giving you how to do it. Here's how you can create your own logic. But so look, philosophy of logic drives a lot of times philosophical logic. It's usually you have some philosophical problem. Like, take a famous example of so-called modal logic. And I don't like calling it logic for various reasons. I think at this point, the terminology doesn't matter as long as we're clear about what we're saying. But I have started to think that calling all these different things logic sort of contributes to a confusion about what on earth we're debating when we're debating whether logic is non-classical versus classical or something.
I've had that same experience, because I now hear about Boolean algebra and Boolean logic and all these different ones, and then I listen to the computer science guys, and they got their own logics for creating different computer games and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And these are just, I mean, again, the terminology, I don't care one way or another, so long as we're clear about what we're talking about. But I do think that when we're debating whether logic itself is non-classical, there we have to really be clear about what it is we're debating, and we can talk about that if you'd like. But
so would you find a difference between philosophy of logic and philosophical logic? Because I've heard like Susan Hack. I think her book is Philosophy of Logics. And then it's been interchangeable. Is that a set, like today, if I find that distinction and say, look, there's philosophy of logic and philosophical logic, are other people going to say, yeah, that's right, that's agreed upon?
Oh yeah. I mean, no, there's absolutely no question.
Cool.
And as I said, see this piece I did with John Burgess, and John is he's in a lot of ways a very conservative and long-standing member of the community in logic and philosophy of logic. And so, yeah, that's just available on my website. But that will give you a sense. There is absolutely no question. Anyone who says that, I mean, okay, so there's a British usage. And this is really where a lot of the confusion comes, I think, is there were various textbooks, including Susan Hack's Philosophy of Logics. But there was another one, Introduction to Philosophical Logic and all this. And that's basically Introduction to the Philosophy of Logic. Yeah. So there was this usage in Britain where philosophical logic was just a stand-in for philosophy of logic. And yeah, it's been really confusing. But I think for the most part, when people use philosophical logic today, if they're actually practicing logic, like if they're actually doing logic and not just philosophy of, they recognize and try to maintain that distinction. Because after all, it could be that you never do any logic yourself, but you start reflecting on the philosophy of logic, right? And you could do that without.
That's where I'm at, kind of. Yeah, I love going deeper. You can go to the metaphysics or meta logic kind of questions without. I'm not very good at straight logic. I'm trying to get better, but it's a totally different thing to actually do it than to think about its foundations or yeah.
So but that distinction is absolutely stable. It's it's as stable as the distinction between mathematical logic and those four major subfields and philosophical logic.
So man, there's so many things that I've been waiting for a logician to come on to. I don't want to I'll cut it off like halfway and we'll go into the Christology stuff. But like I'm thinking of like Gödel, and I read I forgot her name, Rebecca Goldstein, maybe her take or her biography or whatever on Gödel, and she introduced his theories and stuff. Seems like he kind of like blurred the mathematical and philosophical logic. Like he's playing in both sandboxes, and I wanted to do it so bad, but then I saw some of the mathematical logic and I was like, I don't think that's ever going to be me.
Well, I don't know that he blurred them. I mean, remember Gödel was had his own as many of the great logicians have had his own philosophical thoughts. And my understanding is that Gödel, he was motivated by a particular philosophy of mathematics, and it was sometimes, Platonist philosophy of mathematics, where this realities out there.
Mhm.
And yeah, he just wanted to get it right. But so his work wound up being, of deep philosophical interest, though many people, in my view, they try to read way too much philosophy into the results. But
Yeah.
but Gödel, he was simply doing mathematical logic. It just turns out that what he was doing is of real interest to philosophers.
Okay.
And the question of how much interest it really is, I don't know. I mean, it gives a nice example of a certain kind of incompleteness of what's called a non-prime theory. A prime theory is one where the theory contains a disjunction, P or Q, if and only if it contains one of the disjuncts. But, he's looking at, for example, standard arithmetic. This generalizes quickly to set theory and other things. But because these are closed under classical logic, they have excluded middle P or not P as part of the theory for every P in the language of the theory. But Gödel's result is that, if this stuff's consistent, then there's some P such that neither P nor not P is in there.
Yeah.
So, but yeah. So,
well, that sets us up pretty well, actually. So there's two following trains of thought here. So one where you brought up the Platonist, that Gödel was a Platonist. He wanted to establish that or defend that view. And like you said, a lot of people grab his incompleteness and go into the philosophy of mind and say, therefore, robots can't ever think and stuff like that. Yeah, I don't know enough about that. But the other one is he kind of uses, I've heard, I don't know enough about to actually confirm this, but I've heard that he used a type of liar paradox, or used the liar paradox in order to establish his first incompleteness, I think. So that brings us to liar paradox and the metaphysics of logic.
Yeah. What he used, and this isn't, we should not go into Gödel,
Okay.
but I mean, we can, but what he used was closer to, it wasn't quite a liar, but it was very similar. So
Okay.
saying something like that is not wildly off. But what he did was just show how, in some sense, in standard mathematics, so long as certain relations hold within the theory, then the theory always can talk about the syntax itself. And once you have that going, then you can, get in some sense of self-reference.
Yeah.
But stepping away from the precise details of Gödel's results, the liar is, I mean, look, this is just, you don't need mathematics. I mean,
can I want to spend some more time on the liar. Can we just real quick, because that'll take us. I'm ready to do that, but real quick, the metaphysics of logic. Do you think? Sorry to interrupt. Do you think that? What are you, a deflationary theorist? Are you a realist concerning logic?
So people, so I think that we have a what I call a transparent truth predicate in the language. So this to me is the clearest case of what philosophers sometimes call a deflationist truth predicate, or disquotational truth predicate. But for me, there's at least one predicate in the language, and I'm just going to use true here, such that when you predicate this predicate of a sentence, then the sentence itself and that predicate are absolutely intersubstitutable anywhere except in, typical so-called intentional contexts. But yeah, so, and I wrote this book, Spandrels of Truth, about that. And when you bring in a predicate like that, you get unintended side effects of the predicate. And one is these typical paradoxical sentences. You might say, why do you ever need a predicate like that? If you already have the sentence P, and the sentence P is true using this transparent predicate is absolutely, intersubstitutable there. Why did you need it?
Yeah, is it redundant or something?
Yeah, well, the answer is, I wrote a paper long ago. I forget the name of it at this point, but I basically said that God could specify all of reality without ever using the truth predicate, because you don't need to. I mean, God can just say, this is true, this is true, this is true, all through everything. And Parker is sitting, Parker's got, this book on Parker's shelf is colored yellow. This book is colored blue. You could specify all those. What does it add to say it's true that, or the sentence, this book on Parker's shelf is yellow. The sentence, this book on Parker's shelf is blue. What does it add to say, oh, and that sentence is true?
Right.
It doesn't add anything. So why do we have it? Well, a typical story that so-called deflationists say, which I think is right, certainly about this notion of truth, is they point out, well, try to say that all of the books on, every sentence about any of Parker's books is true. Or every sentence of the form book blah has a colored jacket or whatever. If you want to say every one of those sentences of that form is true, how do you do that? Well, you put a name in for the first one. Book 1 has a colored jacket. Book 2. But of course, maybe you got, a couple thousand books. You could do that with enough time on your hands. You could go through and list them all and you'd completely do it. But let's suppose that you have, more books. It doesn't have to be infinitely many, but it could be. How are you going to do it? You can't. You have to quantify in that way. So that's the role that the truth predicate plays. It allows us to sort of do these long generalizations that God could do in, a flash.
Yeah.
But we can't.
Oh, that's an interesting distinction then. Okay.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, maybe I'm totally off, but Frege's Sense and Reference, I think he talks about that, the interchangeability or whatever of truth. And then Davidson picks that up and applies that to facts. And it freaks me out too.
Yeah. So, all those things are related. I think there's some unclarity in Frege and some unclarity in Davidson on these points. Not to say they were wrong, but there's enough unclarity that they might not have been talking exactly about this. But yeah. So, okay. You asked me, am I sort of a deflationist about truth? Well, I think that a central notion of truth is this transparent notion, and you call it deflationist if you want, but I've told you how it works. And but if you ask, do true sentences have metaphysical consequences or something like this, or does saying that, take the sentence, Parker is sitting, right? Take that sentence. Now consider the sentence, Parker, the first sentence is true, right? So there's an attribution of truth to the sentence Parker is sitting.
Yeah.
Okay. You might be asking, does that attribution of truth have metaphysical consequences? Of course. I mean, the whole point of this truth predicate, as Quine said long ago, though in a slightly different context, but the whole point of it is to talk about reality, is to talk about the world.
Right.
It's just that, as I said, with a long list of sentences about your books and stuff, you can't always talk about the world because of just limitations on time, or maybe there are infinitely many claims about the world that, you know, your theory is trying to make. To do that, you just say all these are true. So here's a simple example, right? Take excluded middle, either P or not P. Now, you might not think that that's logically valid, but you might think that many instances of that are true. In fact, you might think infinitely many are true. Well, how would you say that without a truth predicate? You couldn't. But the whole point is you're trying to talk about reality, right?
Yeah.
You just have to use this tool, this truth predicate, to do it.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Okay, I get that. That's good. Okay. Well, okay. I skipped over this one, but that it brings us to the relationship between logic and truth. And is truth rightly the study of truth, is that equally split up the way logic is, or is that synonymous with logic?
So again, the word logic is used in so many different ways that let me just tell you what I think is relevant here. So what's relevant is the relation of logical consequence. So, or logical entailment. This is a relation that's defined over a very small set of vocabulary, namely the logical vocabulary. And this relation is at the bottom of every true theory. Because you want, if you're doing systematic theory, you're trying to get to the complete truth as far as you can, but then you're going to want to close your theory under an entailment relation that will tell you all the consequences of what's in the theory. And when I say close it, I mean, if some claim in the language of the theory is a consequence of a claim in the theory, then that claim that's a consequence is also in the theory. So that's what it means to be closed under. And logic, there are many entailment relations tied to different vocabulary in different languages, and defined over different spaces of logical space. Logical entailment is a sort of foundational basement level one. That's it
applies to all of them.
Yeah, it applies to the it looks at the so-called topic neutral vocabulary, and the reason the vocabulary is so called is that it's involved in all true theories. It doesn't matter the topic. You might have vocabulary. If you're giving a true theory of knowledge, you may have vocabulary about beliefs and justification and all this, but that vocabulary is not going to be in your true theory of physics. And it's not going to be in your true theory of the natural numbers. But all those theories will have in common the elementary logical topic neutral bits that kind of connect things together.
Okay.
So I hope that helps. I mean, as I said, your questions are so sort of deep, and they each deserve, a semester-long seminar.
I appreciate you so much for even giving just a cursory take on those. I'm still here. My thing does that sometimes. Yeah, I appreciate you doing that, because you're kind of putting yourself out there too, where you're like, hey, I've spoken about this. I wrote a whole book on this.
No.
Everyone go check out your books. I was actually I saw you had one with at least one with Grand Priest, and then one with Michael Glansberg.
Michael Glansberg.
Yeah, and it was just, it's crazy. I was so sad that I couldn't get into those books before we talked. So you have to come back on, and we'll have to be able to talk about some more of those.
I would love to, because I'm doing a follow-up book on. I mean, I'm always happy to talk about logic and stuff. I mean, that's what's that's near and dear, and I'm still very active in it. I'll after the current book, I'll be doing a follow-up to Spandrels of Truth. But
Okay. Awesome.
the current book is a follow-up to the Contradictory Christ. It's on the Trinity.
Yeah.
But
is that gonna be called the Contradictory Trinity?
It's going to be called Divine Contradiction.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
Nice. That's good.
Yeah.
All right. So let's get into the liar, so we can set up Glutty and Gappy, and then we can get into the Christology. So you want to just run ahead with it and lay out the liar paradox for us?
Sure. And again, for more detail, I'm okay. I'm pretty sure I wrote a Stanford Encyclopedia piece on this, on the liar paradox.
Oh, no way. That's crazy. I've used that. I did an episode on the liar paradox, and I taught in the undergrad here on that.
Yeah.
So I used that. So if that's by you, then I've already used your work.
Yeah. I think it was me. I think that, I'm almost certain that was me. Me and Michael Glansberg, a friend of mine.
Oh man, I should check the author more often. That's fun.
Yeah. So I just say that for your viewers, if they are interested in.
Yeah.
And actually, just 2 years ago, a book of mine with Glansberg and another logician, David Ripley, we published a book called Formal Theories of Truth, and this is that was also with Oxford, and that's basically for people who have never stepped into liar paradox and formal truth theory. That book was written for them. Okay. So that just came out in, I think, 2018. There may be a paperback version now. I don't remember.
Okay. But I just looked up the SEP on it. Yeah, it's Beall, Glansberg, and Ripley. That's hilarious.
Okay.
So I've read this three or four times. That's so funny.
Okay. Well, anyway, look, the liar is it's something that is very easy to understand. So you've got a sentence that says of itself only that it's false. Mm-hmm. So here's an example. Whatever time it is now, mm-hmm. The sentence I'm now asserting is false. Okay. Well, according to the classical logic account of logical consequence, either that sentence true or it's false. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it has to be one of those. Well, if it's true, then the thing is false. Mm-hmm. So if it's true, it's false. In which case, since we're saying if it's true, it's false, so it would be true and false. Mm-hmm. Now, if it's false, well, that's what it said. That's exactly what it said of itself, that it's false. So it's also true. So the simple liar is one that's true if and only if it's false. And because on the classical logic account of logical consequence, which, remember, applies to all true theories, mm-hmm. At least if those who think the classical logic account is correct, it applies to all true theories. Hence, it applies to your theory of truth and so on. So you've got a contradiction. The liar is true and it's false. Well, according to the classical logic story, that explodes the theory into the so-called trivial theory for the language, which is just the theory containing all sentences in the language of the theory. All right.
Is that the principle of explosion? Did you?
Yeah. Classical logic. So from the principle of explosion is just from an arbitrary contradiction, and by contradiction, I simply mean a sentence of the form: it's true that P and it's false that P.
Right.
Where the truth and falsity operators here are logics. often ignored, logical nullation, or the null operator. It's ignored because
it's like redundant or
it's
something.
completely redundant. Yeah, unlike a truth predicate, but we won't get into that.
Okay.
And
It's good that you distinguish, because I thought they were the same, but I'm glad you distinguished.
No. In fact, logic itself has a truth operator. It's just usually ignored because
I saw it in your book. That was like one of the first times it's a little like T thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can use whatever you want. It's almost never made explicit, but I think it's a shame because nobody rejects its existence. It's just that it's usually left out. But the problem with that is you lose this sort of beautiful symmetry of logic. So logic's falsity operator it's false that, and that's just logical negation.
Yeah.
And then the other side, the dual of that, is it's true that. It's just that people forget that that's in there. So they always put conjunction and disjunction and so on. But so you have truth and falsity operators basic to logic.
That's different than the null, though. The null and negation.
The null I would just equate with the truth operator. It's basically, it just basically takes a sentence and gives you something logically equivalent to that sentence. But you can't, there's a big difference between having the truth operator and a truth predicate. The reason is that every true theory has logic's truth operator in it, whether it's made explicit in the syntax or not.
But they don't all have the truth predicate.
They can't.
Because then everything.
Take a classically closed theory like piano arithmetic, or many theories in metaphysics, or many, they want to close it under classical logic. You can't have a truth predicate then. At least not one that has a standard behavior.
Yeah, the truth predicate is predicating truth, and it's saying this is true with a null operator is just it's for symmetry, and it says here's the falsity, the negation, and here's the null. And but it's not saying it's true or false. You can see that in a disjunction.
Yeah. You're getting there. So let me point you to another paper that might be useful. Just we don't have to talk about it, but it might be useful for your interest or your viewers, and that is transparent truth as a logical property. I think that this too is on my website, entailments.net, and this came out in a book edited by Michael Lynch and some others, readings on truth. It just came out by MIT Press. But there I distinguish, the truth operator and the truth predicate and all that. But you can think about it this way. Here's the difference, right? This isn't the question you asked, but you might as well if you're interested.
Yep.
So a sentential connective or a sentential operator, and at this point we're talking about unary ones. These are ones that take exactly one sentence and make a sentence. So it's true that it's got a blank there, and you put in a sentence and you have a new sentence, namely it's true that P, right? So if you took the sentence P, you put it in there, you have a new one, it's true that P. But you have to have the sentences to begin with before you can apply the operator.
Yep.
Okay. Now consider a predicate. A predicate has a blank, the way an operator does, but it doesn't take a sentence. It takes the name of something, right? So I'm just talking about unary predicates. So, and we'll just even restrict it to sentences, to predicates that are, applied to sentences. So here has more than 15 words in it. That's a predicate. It's a unary predicate. But you'd need the name of a sentence that you could put in there. So take the sentence, but name it. Parker is sitting, and you put that name of that sentence into the gap in that predicate has more than 15 words in it, and you produce a false sentence. Consider the unary predicate has less than 15 words in it. Put the same sentence, Parker is sitting, name that, put that in that gap, and you get a true sentence, and so on. Okay. that's all. So sentential operators take sentences, they have to already be there. Predicates take names of sentences. Well, they take names of all sorts of things. We're focusing just on predicates applied to sentences.
Okay.
Now, that's where you get the liar paradox.
Yes.
You don't get the liar paradox from the truth operator because you didn't have liars in there. So you couldn't like generate a liar by using the truth operator because you already have to have the sentence to begin with.
Okay. That's important because sometimes people will, maybe I'm getting this right. Sometimes people say there's no semantic content to that sentence. And so it's not it's a faux sentence, and let's put it aside. And I've thought that. I know other philosophers do, but I know lay folks as well who just go, it doesn't seem like it.
That though is that's different between the distinction between the operator and the predicate.
Right.
Just to tie that off, and then we'll jump.
Okay.
But I just want to show you that to generate a liar, you have to have a truth predicate versus an operator. Once you have a predicate, well, according to the grammar, you can put whatever name you want in the predicate's gap, and you thereby have a sentence. So to use a sort of variation of an example that Saul Kripke used, take the name Bob and put Bob is false. According to grammar, that's a sentence because it's got a singular term put in the one gap within the unary predicate. Now, of course, the mere syntax doesn't say anything.
Right.
So it's always under, it's what the semantics is. Well, there is absolutely nothing, as Kripke emphasized, standing in the way of letting the name Bob denote, wait for it, the sentence, Bob is false.
Yeah.
If that denotes that very sentence, then now the sentence Bob is false talks about itself.
Yeah.
And it says of itself nothing more nor less than it's false. Okay. So that's the difference between predicate and a unary operator. But you got the sentence that I gave an example. This very sentence is false. As you say, some people say that that's meaningless or whatever. I say, okay, well, I would love to know how. And if they can explain in what way it's meaningless, I would really like to learn that. If they say, well, it entails a contradiction, I'm like, well, I mean, even by the lights of classical logic, contradictions aren't meaningless. They can stand in the relation of logical consequence.
Right.
Indeed, they have more meaning than anything. They entail all sentences in the classical story.
Well, so just with the plain liar, some people, I don't know if Bos van Frossen totally follows this or not, but he at least lays it out in a paper that people will use like a Straussonian presupposition and say it's a failure of presupposition, and so it's neither true nor false, and then you move on to the strengthened liar, but or the revenge of the liar. But concerning the actual liar itself, could you say it's a failure of presupposition, and that's just the plain liar is neither true nor false?
I mean, I think you certainly could. You could say it's neither true nor false. You'd be going against the classical logic account of logical consequence. But I mean, to me, how people ever thought that was the right account across the board, like as the right account of logical consequence versus the right account of how the logical vocabulary behaves in a particular theory.
Yeah.
I just don't know how this ever happened. But anyway.
Well, so that would make us, if we did follow Van Frossen there, that would put us into saying that there are gappy, that would make us gappy theorists. Like we'd have gappy sentences in our vocabulary then.
I mean, I think that Van Frossen's program, and Van Frossen remains very instrumental and influential in my career. But I think that his program is even by his own lights, is not promising as an account of the liar. His supervaluations technique is enormously influential and a fantastic tool. But as applied to the liar, I mean, the reason I'm humming and hawing is that to say on his account that it's neither true nor false, I mean, if you use his notion of super truth and super falsity, then yeah, it's neither super true nor super false. But there's a simpler way of getting. By the way, Bas van Frassen was very influential in my career, as I said, and I love his work. He's still doing great work in philosophical logic, and so I don't want anyone thinking that I don't think well of that. But I think just in the present context, it might be easier just to think about rejecting classical logic on the excluded middle part. That is, that every sentence is either true or false. But you don't have to go the Van Frassen route to do that. You could. There are plenty of simple subclassical ways you could go for that.
Okay. So when it comes to the liar, before we get to the strengthened liar, no matter what, would you say? So yeah, Van Frassen, it's really technical, and maybe it's incorrect. For just explaining that to an intro to philosophy student, what do you make of the liar paradox? Would you tell them this is neither true nor false, or do you have different language for that?
Okay, so for a simple liar, look, on the account of logical consequence that I think is correct, and if you want to know why I think it's correct, the best place to go is my paper, The Simple Argument for Subclassical Logic. And a copy of this is available on my website as well. I mean, these are all available in journals and stuff, but so Simple Argument for Subclassical Logic. The account of logic that I think is correct, excluded middle, that is either P or not P, is that is not logically valid. And moreover, its dual of explosion, P and not P, gives you everything. That's not logically valid. So let me point out these are mirror images of each other. The dual, what I meant by that was, so excluded middle is usually, some people just say, well, P or not P, that's logically true. What they mean is logically valid, and then that's supposed to entail the truth. But really the way to think of it is arbitrary P, conclusion, arbitrary Q or not Q, okay? And excluded middle says that going from arbitrary P to arbitrary, the disjunction of Q and not Q, is logically valid. If you turn that upside down and spin it, you get, arbitrary P and not P, because the disjunction turned upside down is a conjunction.
Did you just do a contraposition by explaining?
No, I just flipped it and turned it.
Okay, because that might be really helpful for me thinking through logic, and that's helpful.
Yeah, wow. But now explosion is just the sort of P and not P, arbitrary P and not P gives you arbitrary Q for any Q you want. Excluded middle is arbitrary Q, gives you P or not P for any P you want. And the account of logical consequence that I think is correct is one where both of these just go way beyond what logic validates. So in my case on the liar, which is which one to know, a sentence like this very sentence is false, that logically that can be gappy. that is neither true nor false. But it can be glutty. It can be both true and false. But look, logic alone is not going to tell you what the truth is.
Yeah, I love that you said that. It doesn't press the issue, you said.
Yeah, it doesn't. It truly doesn't press the issue.
Or force the issue.
Yeah. I mean, look, when we're trying to come to true theories, we're usually following rules of thumb. If there were precise rules for finding the full truth and nothing but the truth, look, life would be so easy. But it's not. So we're guided by these methodological rules of thumb. And one is when you're trying to give the truth about a particular phenomenon, you want to give the complete theory. That is the full truth about it. That is for any sentence in the language of the theory P. You want to either put P in the theory or its logical negation. It's false to P. You want to put one of those. You want to decide one of those with respect to the phenomenon you're working on. There's also a consistency constraint. For any P in the language of the theory, try not to put both P and it's false to P in there. Just put one. So the completeness says put at least one. The consistency says put only one. But then there's also a very important constraint at work in our best science, in our best philosophy, in our best theology, in my opinion, is guided by this sense of simplicity. And not just an Occam-like simplicity, but simplicity and naturalness. You take these three rules of thumb, and you're looking at, you're giving a theory of truth, and you're looking at the liar paradox, right? Okay. Well, what are you going to say about this sentence? Well, the completeness one tells you, try to put either the sentence is true or the sentence is false. But if you put either one of those in there, then you're forced to buck the consistency constraint.
Yeah.
Well, if you try to be consistent, you can do that. Logic says you can do that. But now it's like, what about the simplicity constraint and naturalness? I mean, here you've got a sentence. It says absolutely nothing more nor less than I'm false. Isn't the most natural treatment of this thing? Logic allows you to say it's neither true nor false. Logic allows you to say it's both. You're after the simplest, most natural account. Isn't that to say it's actually both? I mean, after all, the thing is true if and only if it's false.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't that be a weird case of both?
Yeah.
There's another self-referential sentence in the language. I'm true. It says of itself nothing more nor less than that it's true. It's a truth teller. Okay. Logic allows you to say that that's both. But why would you?
Right.
Why would why it allows you to say it's neither? And there it looks like, well, in this case, it looks like a gap.
Yeah. So it's a systematic theoretician that forces the issue, because logic doesn't have a voice.
Yes, you're exactly right. I mean, logic constrains the theory. It gives you the broadest space of possibilities from which your theory can draw. And then part of theorizing is to try to get the full, as consistent as reality allows, together with the simplest and natural one. You're trying to carve out from those gazillion logical possibilities just the space that are theoretically possible.
Yeah.
Given the phenomenon. It's reality that's going to determine that. And you say, well, how do you know? Well, of course, that we don't. We just do the best we can, and we try to come up with the right account. You don't know in advance. If we did, it'd be easy.
Yeah. Okay, I'm thinking maybe someone in the comments or something might be, and maybe it's me. I was thinking, what about, like, we didn't talk a ton about modal logics, but isn't there some kind of modality concerns that we can do from our armchair and just say, like, this is not possible?
Well, people can do whatever they want, especially from their own armchair, as far as I'm concerned. But look, I just see no reason. Again, I would say go to my paper, the simple argument for subclassical logic, and there, look. The point is this: we haven't even talked about theology, which to me is like that's the most important and interesting case. I mean, but people who think you can escape these weird paradoxical sentences have just not engaged. You know, even Tarski, who is a great logician, he basically said, if you want a truth predicate for your theory, it can't be in the language of the theory. You have to give it in a different one. Otherwise, you get these liars and all that. And he said,
it sounds like Gödel a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, he said, I am not, though, hereby giving you an account of truth in natural language, in real language, because he said, real language allows for all this stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway,
no, that's really helpful. I think in my episode on liar paradox, I talked about there's this Jewish philosopher, and he was talking with J.L. Austin at Oxford. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I forgot the Jewish philosopher's name. He's awesome. He's not. He happened to be a Jewish guy, and he was also a philosopher. But he had the Jewish witticism, and he talked about having two affirmatives making a negative. And Austin's getting all his feathers getting all ruffled. No, and he goes out through all the logical consequences and showing how it's not possible. And the philosopher looks at it and goes, "Yeah."
Well, that story has been attributed to just about every witty philosopher on earth. So I don't know where the truth resides on that, but that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because our natural language is richer or fuller, and yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
So we got the simple liar. Oh man, what's the more simple liar? The one below the liar. So there you got the strengthened liar, the liar, weakened liar, I guess. The weakened liar, would you say just false? It's.
Oh, do you mean the truth teller, or what do you mean?
No, we didn't talk about it, but the weakened liar is like the one that's less. Maybe that's a particular to Van Frossen's take. We don't have to talk about that, but let's.
Okay.
So you have the simple liar, and that is it's both. The strengthened liar or the revenge liar. Maybe you could lay that out for us and then tell us what you think about it.
So really, details matter, and what to say matters. So the strengthened liar occurs once you try to give some account that goes beyond the basic language that we started with. So let me just give a pattern for your viewers. So take take the simple liar that says I'm false, and that's supposed to be you get a contradiction. It's either true or false, then it's both. But people might think, okay, well, this whole sentence, we have to give up the principle that every single sentence or proposition, however you want to talk, is true or false. There's an exception. The bad sentences, they don't get to be true or false. So your response is the simple liar is bad, and that's problem solved.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, remember, language will always these things are unavoidable, and to see how okay, you've got this new category of bad, and bad is supposed to be somehow in contradiction with truth, right? And falsity, I guess.
Right.
So now consider the sentence that says either I'm false or I'm bad.
Yeah.
Okay, well, What are you going to say? Well, your big solution is supposed to say it's bad. But if you say it's bad, then one of the disjuncts is true. So now it's true and bad. So lo and behold, you've got true, but nonetheless bad sentences.
Yeah.
And so now some people will just sort of not see the inevitability of this pattern and will say, okay, new category, super bad. Well, I mean, you can tell me what the problem is, right? It's going to be, okay, either I'm false or I'm bad or I'm super bad. And so the revenge problem is just that. It's that every time you try to introduce new categories for these things, it looks like you get the problem back.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so great. And so through the liar and, well, I guess, do you say the strengthened liar is both true and false?
Well, it depends. It depends on which. I mean, see, that's the other thing. If we're using just the transparent notion of truth that we discussed earlier,
Yeah.
Then the strengthened liar really reduces to the simple liar. Because if that's logical negation in there when you're saying I'm not true, then that's just logical negation. It's false that, and the truth operator is transparent. So it's going to reduce to I'm false.
That's what I thought. But I think, do you have a different take as well, or?
Well, for that, no, I don't.
Okay,
I mean, but if you, sometimes we're not talking about transparent truth. Sometimes we're using some more robust notion of semantic truth or something. And in that case, I don't think that a strengthened liar would reduce to the simple. But it's not even obvious that we get a simple one with a more robust notion of truth. So, yeah.
So all this to say and to set up the fact that there are gappy sentences, which are there's glutty sentences, which are both true and false. And I don't know if we've established that there's gappy ones that are neither true or false, but it kind of depends on how you're answering the solution. But you're saying, hey, natural languages has more options than just the truth and false.
Yeah.
And it's you call it subclassical. To me, it's like there's 4 categories now, so it should be like super. It's like above and beyond what the classical.
Yeah. You're not the first to say that. But the reason I say subclassical is that if you take all the patterns that the classical logical account validates, so according to the classical logical theory, you have all these patterns, including arbitrary P implies Q or not Q, and the dual explosion. The subclassical account just chops off some of those. So that's why it's a sub-relation.
Because you've lost the principle of excluded middle.
And explosion, that's right.
And explosion, okay.
Yeah, so you cut those off, and you have a proper sub-relation of the, and by the way, I mean, my own view is simple. What's the situation here? Well, my view is that logic, being topic neutral and universal, it only validates so much of what the classical story says, but where you get those extra principles being valid is within the constraints of a theory. So classical logic as we know it was actually constructed as an account of how the logical vocabulary behaves in true mathematical theories.
Yeah.
And I think it got it right. But there are very simple ways, and again, I could point to various papers. These ones are going to be a little bit more technical than the ones I've talked about, but you know, basically you get classical logic back from the sort of subclassical relation that I think is correct for the universal relation. You get subclassical, or you get the classical relation back as a special case within a theory that does what? Well, basically, it rules out the logical possibility of gluts, and it says, sure, those are logically possible, but for this phenomenon, they're not even theoretical option.
Yeah.
And the same with gaps. You roll both of those out, and the logical entailment now just behaves like classical logic.
Yeah. That's interesting. Another interesting thing was you talked about how classical logic is more of a modern phenomena than we usually think. We always back to Aristotle, all the way back, and you mentioned how it's kind of a more of a modern, even 20th century, maybe late 18th century, 20th century, 20th century, invention or not just invention, but phenomena that's arisen. Thought that was really interesting. Subclass. Some people, you know this because you've been on different shows, but they'll want to do a really simple, they'll try to do a simple reductio and just say, well, how about like the law of non-contradiction? Should I believe that Dr. Beall, his project is both true and not true? And they'll want to say that, the law of non-contradiction still applies to every system. And I think you've affirmed that, though, haven't you? Like you've said, well, maybe you said logical entailment instead of non-contradiction.
Logical entailment is a relation that's in every true theory. Mm-hmm. It underwrites the entailment relation of any true theory, and every. But explosion, that is an arbitrary contradiction, entails whatever you want, all the sentences in the language. That is certainly valid within some true theories, no question. Mm-hmm. And if you're puzzled by that, just go back to what I said. I mean, look, logic provides you 4 basic possibilities, right? For any given sentence, logic says, well, it could just be true by itself, could just be false by itself, right? It could be both true and false. Yeah. So the theory has to contain both P and its negation. Or it could be neither. It could be gappy with respect to the sentence. So the theory contains neither P nor its negation. Mm-hmm. That's logic. For any sentence in any theory's language, logic gives you those to start with. But the hard work of theorizing is figuring out the ones that are right for the bit of reality you're looking at, the phenomenon in question. And here, my own view, there are philosophers and logicians who disagree with this, but my own view is that mathematics itself is entirely, the truth about mathematics is just classical. So what happens in true mathematical theories, and again, Zach Weber, Chris Mortensen actually think that they're, and one of the pioneers of contemporary paraconsistent logic, Florencio Asenjo, they all thought that contradictions are in our true mathematical theories as well. But that is that leaving out contradictions, you're leaving out part of the truth. That's what they thought. Wow. But I think that true mathematical theories, or at least some of them, let's just say, leave it there. Sure. They are closed entirely classical. How's that? Well, again, at the start, logic gives you all these basic 4 possibilities, and in mathematics, you just roll out the gaps and the gluts. Yeah. Well, once you roll those out, you've thereby rolled out, on one hand, by rolling out the gaps, you've rolled out any counterexamples to excluded middle. Mm. Once you roll out the gluts, you've thereby ruled out any counterexamples to explosion. Yeah. And so if the reality is fully described without any of those things, it's going to be classically, all those principles are going to be validated. The question is whether, I mean, it's just so hard for me to see how anyone could think that those 2 possibilities exhaust logical space given brief reflection on reality.
Well, that is a perfect setup for the theology. Why? The question then is why should we or shouldn't we rule out gaps and gluts in our philosophical or in our theological theorizing? Just a real brief biographical note. Did you come to this position of the contradictory Christ first, like growing up thinking, Christ is contradictory, and then I'm going to do my logic in order to help establish that or explain that, not establish, or were you doing, grand priests in your ear and you're talking about, maybe dialethian options or something, and then you came to see, oh, this actually could be helpful in theology?
I would say it's a bit of both, actually. You
chose the glutty option there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, it was a false choice. Yeah. So I would say a bit of both. I mean, I don't know anyone who, reflects on the incarnation understood as Christ being one person, fully human and fully divine, and doesn't see apparent contradiction. Mm-hmm. I don't know anyone who's, and yeah, I just saw that as something else. I didn't really apply logic to it, really. I mean, when I first started thinking about it, I was not sufficiently systematic in my own reflection, and I just sort of took that to be, well, that's one thing, but and then when I would sort of go after the truth about something else, it would always sort of, I would behave as if these contradictory or gappy options weren't available. In the case of Christ, the gap just isn't available. Though in chapter 5, I give what I think is a completely underexplored and fascinating gappy theology that somebody needs to take up just to see how far it runs. I have my own reasons for thinking that it's not the correct view, but anyway.
There's some Orthodox constraints, maybe saying, Christ wasn't really a man, and now he's no longer God. If you take a good guy,
exactly. If you allow that stuff to go, but actually, no, I'm saying hold the Orthodox claims. Anyway, sure. I forget in chapter. I think in the index, gap theoretic theology or something is in there, but that anyway. But my own view was, I just kept these things separate. My own work in logic and philosophy of logic, dovetailed with like Zach Weber, Chris Mortensen, Graham Priest. Greg Restall is a close friend and a fantastic logician. Greg is not a glut theorist himself, but he's probably knows as much about glut theory as anyone on the planet. So all that, I had time to think hard about the logic. And I spent most of my career, in philosophy, I'm mainly known for logic and philosophy of logic. And I think that had I tried to publish some of my work on in analytic theology before doing all that hard work on logic and philosophy of logic, it would have just been more, just more work. So how did I come to it? I can't say the one was before the other. And I do know a logician, but I'm not going to mention his name. He wouldn't be broadly known in philosophy. He's well known in paradox and stuff. But he actually, his own Christian views led him to look at paraconsistent and paracomplete logic. But I'm not. But I don't feel at liberty to talk. He never talks about it publicly. So
okay.
Yeah.
So some people might be frustrated with this, but I had to ask you all these things. I've just been waiting so long to talk with a logician about this. So now we can get into like the contradictory Christ. And again, in the book, I don't know how many times you said it. Maybe I should have marked it, but you say, I genuinely mean it. Christ is a contradictory being. I'm not hiding. I'm not using flowery language. This isn't a good sermon topic to, I'm not making a point. I'm saying he literally is a contradictory being. Can you lay that out for us just briefly so we can continue?
Yeah. And by the way, before I do, I don't know how much editing you do, but I'm thinking for the sake of your viewers, feel free to chop everything in half.
Sure.
But do whatever you obviously.
Yeah, I've got some that are 2.5 that people really like, and this is just so interesting. I know I have a lot of philosopher professors that listen, which I did not expect, and they're gonna eat up everything you've talked about.
Okay. Okay. So shifting to the theology. Right. So when I say, the main thesis of that book, The Contradictory Christ, is that Christ is a contradictory being. What do I mean by that? Well, as we said earlier, a contradiction is a sentence of the form, it's true that P and it's false that P. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And P here is any declarative sentence. Think of it as a propositional variable, whatever you want. It's true the P and it's false the P. And by the way, it's true that and false that are logic's unary operators. They're not some fancy, highly technical notions or something. Okay. So that's what we mean by a contradiction. It's true the P, it's false the P. A contradictory being is one of whom a contradiction is true. So a contradictory claim is one that entails a contradiction. A contradictory being is a being, the true description of whom entails a contradiction. All right. So in what way is Christ a contradictory being? Well, exactly as it looks from, standard core Christology. Christ is fully divine. Christ is fully human. To many, this just appears to be a contradiction. Now, as you said, if Christ were more than one person, okay, no, not even a hint of contradiction, because you could have the one divine Christ being divine and the one human Christ being human, but that's been ruled out as non-standard, so that's not the core doctrine.
I thought that was a really helpful note that you mentioned, and I heard it in different interviews that you've done, but you said this is what all the heretics wanted to do. They all wanted to get rid of the contradiction, and so it doesn't necessarily mean if you're trying to get rid of a contradiction that you are a heretic, but that way lies heresy. So be careful if you're going to do that.
That's exactly right. I think that sometimes people are taught that heretics, and I mean, it's horrible, the history of heretics being burned at the stake and worse. And all this great analytic theology being done in St. Andrews, but every time I go there, I cringe when I go for a walk and I see this big monument to the martyrs and the cathedral that's been burned down. And anyway, so heretics, it's not as if they're like these, bad or lazy or stupid or whatever thinkers. These people are like, okay, well, that can't be right. One person, fully divine, fully human. Okay, here's an idea. Fully divine, just appearing to be human, but not fully human. Or instead, fully human, not really divine, but an important representative, like some of the great prophets or something. Anyway, you go through all these different heresies. They all result from an attempt to consistentize Christ, to try to give a true, complete, and consistent account. My own view is you'd be better off if consistency is so important, and I take it that, you know, God must have declared that only consistent theories are true, for such passion to be behind this search. But if consistency is so important, then just chop off half the truth. Just don't, you know, just leave it out. Cling to, you know, that, remember the 3 methodological rules. 1, seek complete theories. For any sentence P in the language, try to give either P or its false to P in the theory. Consistent, try never to give both. Simple, natural. Well, if consistency is such a big deal, then just chop off half the truth. You know, don't allow the, just block all the entailments. You could even have the claim Christ is fully divine, Christ is fully human in your theory, but you refuse to close it under what that entails. Hey, you can get consistency that way. By my lights, a responsible, systematic thinker has to, you know, try to give the full story and close it under the entailments. But
well, we have theological reasons for bracketing off in the theological system. We have internal rules for bracketing off gappy solutions because they're heresies. But you would say there are no systematic, or there are no theological rules for bracketing off glutty options. There's no heresy of affirming a contradiction according to the person of Christ.
Well, I mean, I think that the standard doctrine of Christ that's definitive of core Christian theology does affirm a contradiction. It's just that everyone wants to say, oh, no. But of course, it's not contradictory. It only looks that way. And I'm like, why do you say that? Truly, why do you say that? And, you know, some answers will be, well, because it can't really be a contradiction and it's logically impossible. Well, this tells me that the person, you know, simply hasn't engaged in sufficient reflection on a theory of logic.
And if they have, perhaps they're holding classical logic more tightly than, or they're prioritizing classical logic over what we think, what the naive not in a bad way, but just the like folk, or just the immediate understanding of Christology. You're prioritizing your classical logic above.
Look, right? You've seen this, right? So, you know, you start saying, look, the standard doctrine is that Christ is one person, fully divine, fully human. And it's like, well, then fully divine has all divine properties, right? All the limitlessness. Fully human, well, has all the limits that are involved in being human, and so on. And immediately, it's like, okay, this is hard to make sense of because it looks like it's contradictory, so it can't be contradictory. So, and then they start running instead of letting, you know, the reality of that drive the actual theory and saying, no, this is what we hold. Instead, people go through and of course, you know, another person whose work I respect deeply, and as a friend, Oliver Crisp. I got a chance to look at your interview with Oliver, and there's people start talking, well, it's just sort of a model, or it's just analogical, or it's just, you know, well, what are we doing, right? I mean, either we're trying to get at the truth and we're giving it, in which case, don't say this is just analogical unless you explain what on earth analogical this is true analogically. Okay, what does that mean? Is that some new notion of truth that's like true by degrees? Or no, it's analogically predicated. Okay, well, what is that? Tell me. There's no account of what it is for the exemplification relation to be. Okay, so I don't know what they're saying, and then it's like maybe it's another language. Well, what's true of Christ and what's true of God is in a different language that we don't have access to. Okay, well then now you've lost me. Like, I have no clue what you're talking about. By the way, I didn't mean to say Oliver Holt.
No, of course, yeah, but a strong sense of like ineffability is like, well, now we don't know who God is, though. You've also cut off God.
Exactly. So let's back up and let's just say, right? The claim is Christ is one person, fully divine, fully human.
Yeah,
and that looks like it entails that Christ was omniscient, and that Christ is ignorant, and so on. And it's like, well, hold on, now we're just contradicting. Well, you know, the standard doctrine is there because to say less than Christ being fully divine, and to say fully human, is to leave out important truths of Christ. When you realize that you achieve both through contradiction, people want to say, okay, but we're still sensible people. We make sense. It's just like we have this analogical way of talking, which never gets laid out, by the way. I mean, I can think of different ways of modeling it, but none of it ultimately works. I mean, it's not as if, I mean, I don't know why people think it somehow is not fully embracing and respecting the transcendence of God unless you say that our language can't really apply. I think the real driver there, I think that's, I have never seen good argument for that. I think the real driver is, if it's not that, if we're not actually like speaking in some non-standard way, then we're speaking with contradiction.
Yeah.
And so this is what's driven my book, is it's like, look, realize that instead of letting the reality drive your account of what logical consequence, you're wedded to this position about logic that itself is independently implausible.
Yeah. That's what was scary for me when you started turning me towards your view, because it's not at first, you know, not knowing a ton of your ideas in theology, it seems like, well, a lowest common denominator, hey, it's kind of a defense, it's kind of an apologetic move. Instead of trying to come up with some big theory, we can just say Christ's contradictory. But after hearing you more and reading your book, it's really motivating, because you're saying, I want to start with the phenomena of theology and then we'll go from there. And if this seems like a contradiction, then it seems like we can have contradictions, because this is one of the most important things that we could get right on. And so let that drive our theory instead of some other theory, which you say is classical, going back to Aristotle, but might not actually be. And so in that sense, your project is so much more simple than everyone else's huge model. But one of the benefits, and I know you know this, is that you've had years and years and years of saying it's not crazy to say, to affirm not subclassical logic, where the rest of us are like driven in by all of our intro to logic classes that is crazy, and you've just made God a liar.
Right. Yeah. And that's really, I'm glad you said that. Let me flag, by the way, that you know, Aristotle said some things about non-contradiction and excluded middle and stuff, but the theory of classical logic as we have it was devoted. Nobody knew exactly what on earth Aristotle was saying. He did elaborate on a number of things, but when you try to make them precise, it doesn't go very well. So anyway, I just wanted to say that people who say it goes back to Aristotle, well, Aristotle was harping against contradiction for sure. But of course, was Aristotle reflecting on the liar itself? It was certainly around, but he wasn't reflecting on it. Was he reflecting on Christ at that point and the full divinity? Nope, certainly not. Yeah. So anyway, okay. But as you say, I have had almost 20 years working on nothing but logic and the philosophy of logic. And it astounds me now that I'm engaged in analytic theology to see, like, I'm just not used to people saying, oh, but that's just so,
Yeah.
like, I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, and people like, yeah, it gets hammered. It gets hammered in, and it's unfortunate.
This is why I wanted to spend so much time talking logic with you, so people could see this is not some random dude who just came up with a theory. He's been doing all this work, and if you're going to come at, like, you're a nice guy, but maybe you shouldn't be, because if someone's going to come at you and say, well, Dr. Beall, it's like, how rude that you don't even respect him enough to know that he's not crazy, like he's worked through this.
That's right. I mean, I did see. I did an interview somewhere, and people were like, "Oh, this is just nonsense," and all that. It's like, wait, I don't know that I'm a nice guy. I'm actually very impatient, but I do care about getting at the truth. And if somebody says that, I'm used to people saying, "Here's why."
Right.
I'm not used to people saying, oh, this is just, this is, and walking away. I mean, look, do whatever you want. But if you actually have something to contribute that shows a serious problem, I would want to know. Like, I very much want to know.
Yeah.
But people who say, oh, contradiction, now you're saying God's a liar. I mean, okay, I don't mean this to be in any way mean, but I would expect that of maybe like a third grader or something like that, because they can't distinguish lying from truth and falsity. How is Christ being a contradictory being make Christ a liar?
Yeah.
Where's the intention to deceive?
Right.
There isn't one.
Yeah.
So why would you ever say that unless you just didn't have the concept of lying versus saying something false, or
Well, so Dr. Beall, I do catch that, and if I could motivate it a little bit more, I might, maybe people are saying, okay, you've entered, you've allowed for a true contradiction, of Christ's ontology, or metaphysically, like he's a contradictory being.
Yeah.
If a contradiction can be true of Christ's nature or natures, then could it not also be true of the Godhead? And actually writing a book about that as well. But could that not follow then? God has told us that he's good. He told us that he can't contradict himself, or that he doesn't deny himself. We usually say contradict, but he can't deny himself. Could that, if there's a contradiction that's true of his nature, couldn't he deny himself and not deny himself, maybe?
Well, I think people need to be clear about what exactly they're talking about. I mean, what do you mean by deny? I mean, look, the full truth of, let's just talk about Christ for now. Yeah, the book on the Trinity is coming. Let's just talk about Christ. So, the full truth of Christ involves the claim that Christ knows all truths, and that there are truths that Christ does not know.
Mm-hmm.
It's false that Christ knows all truths. I would say the same for, you look at the history of theology and the wrestling back, and actually Oliver, your interview with Oliver, Chris, he brings this out nicely in some of his work, of the tension you feel between, because you're right at the verge of contradiction when you try to balance the transcendence and immanence of Christ himself, right? And I've told Oliver that, it's not tension. It's not tension. It's contradiction. The reality is contradictory. And now, so the truth about Christ is contradictory. So if Christ says, there's some truth I don't know, right? Well, I mean, it depends on, I'm not taking a firm stance on that particular claim, but because it's true that Christ knows all truths, that's got to be false.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also false that Christ knows all truths. So that sort of claim you'd naturally treat as true as well. Is Christ lying? No, of course not. Is he saying something false? Well, again, I'm not taking the official stance on that particular claim, but there will be many like it. Let's just stipulate that it is true and false on my account.
Okay.
Is it false? Yes. Is Christ thereby a liar? No. I mean,
He's
that's
still
just,
speaking the truth. Yeah.
that's just silly. To be a liar, you could speak the truth and be a liar, right? Yeah. Lying is all about intent. It often involves falsehood, but it doesn't have to.
Yeah.
But if Christ is asserting the truth, if it's also false, well, it's also false. I mean, Christ is a unique reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. There's a few more, and I think we can close it.
I feel like we haven't said anything, and
I know. Yeah. Okay. So, I want to talk. You addressed the qua move, so-called qua move, or some theologians might know it as partitive exegesis. When you're exegeting text and you're parting out and saying Christ, according to his nature, human nature according to his divine nature. There's a qua move, and then there's Anderson's accrue. I'm sure you're not going to like this, but there's like a qua move that you can do if you hold to like an authorial analogy that God is the author of the world, and he's analogous to an author. So again, we're going at analogy, but he's analogous in that he authored the world by his speech. He spoke and it was, just like an author. Tolkien created Middle Earth by writing, right? But he's entered into the story in every act that God does, but also particularly in the incarnation. And so it's like a authorial qua move, that a qua the character Christ, he is limited in his knowledge, but qua the author outside of the text, the extra Calvinisticum that Christ has, he's unlimited in his understanding. Why not go that route? I guess it is adding extra, right? It's adding a whole different theory of authorial analogy that comes with its own problems. Is that it's just not as simple as saying it's a contradiction?
Yeah, I mean, look, the core doctrine is Christ is one person, fully
Mm-hmm.
divine, fully human. The core doctrine isn't Christ according to this story is that and this, and Christ according to that story is this and that.
Mm-hmm.
So now it might say, well, that's the intended interpretation of the core doctrine. Okay, then we have to ask, is this Christ the same person?
Mm-hmm.
Are all these properties Christ's? So the omniscience, is that truly Christ? Is Christ omniscient?
Mm-hmm.
The ignorance, is that truly Christ? And if the answer is no, then it's not clear that we're talking about the standard Orthodox doctrine.
Yeah.
If the answer is yes, then fine. Okay, great. It's a lovely, nice story, but it doesn't get around the contradiction because you still got Christ being all-knowing and not.
I like that. So this is what I've been thinking since reading the book. So could you have the qua move and contradictory Christ?
I think you could. The question is whether you need to. I mean, look, I think that the qua stuff is actually really important.
Okay.
That might surprise you.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's important because it provides a viable way around the contradiction. We shouldn't be trying to get around the contradiction.
Okay.
The reality is contradictory. The only thing holding you back from seeing that is this absolute, sort of unfounded commitment to this theory of logic.
Yeah.
But So the qua stuff isn't valuable because it gets you around the contradiction. You shouldn't be getting around the contradiction. Otherwise, you're missing part of the truth.
Mhm.
Well, then how's it valuable? Well, it's valuable in exactly the one place where everyone says it can't really be doing a lot of work. Namely, when we say qua his divine nature, Christ is omniscient. Qua his human nature, Christ is ignorant. What do we mean there? Well, if we're speaking truly and not running from the contradiction, we're explaining how it is Christ who has these properties.
Yeah.
So the qua move there is simply an explanation of how Christ has those properties. But it's not some way around the contradiction. Instead, it's an explanation of the contradiction.
I think that's really, really helpful because in hearing people talk about your project, I'm sure I probably had this idea too. It's just like, we don't need explanation now because it just say it's a contradiction. It's a contradiction. No, of course you still need the explanation.
Of course you do.
Theology is still on the table here.
Right.
We still have to deal with the phenomena of Scripture and with
yeah. Sorry. I mean, but my fear is like, I fear that people in apologetics have a view of apologetics that I just have never understood, and it's all about sort of like winning an argument and like, you know, convincing the skeptic and all that. Look, you shouldn't be trying to win an argument. I mean, you know, Jesus' last commandment before he died was not, hey, make sure you win the arguments and all that.
Yeah.
That's not what people should be doing as apologists. Moreover, convincing somebody, that's not your job, never has been, never will be. That's up to God. God can do that, and only God. You're not going to do it.
Yeah.
So don't have that view of apologetics. So what's the role of apologetics? Simply to take the true theory, complete as it can be, and if there's a genuine objection to it, that sort of shows a serious problem, well, try to understand whether it is in fact a problem. And when I say genuine objection, look, people can charge incoherence and badness all they want. People do. Look around the globe. People can say and do say all sorts of things they haven't thought about. Mm-hmm. They're just in the mood to say, well, that's, nonsense, or that's this, that's that. Nobody should be taking 2 minutes to answer these charges.
Yeah.
If somebody is actually after the truth and they formulate a serious problem with the theology, that should be addressed, because these people are trying to understand it in a truth-seeking fashion, and that should be addressed. Yeah. But any other sort of activity of, you're not going to win the debate, or you're not going to convince, even James Anderson, who in a very prescient work that I know you know well, his Paradox Christian Theology, he anticipated a glut theoretic solution, but one objection he had was that this will never, I can't remember exactly, but it's something like it won't convince, unless you're already convinced. But I thought, well, that's not our job anyhow. So
that's a great point. And some people might say that your Reformed upbringing might be showing its colors here, but not necessarily so. But I do like what you said. It's not our job to convince, but that we still have explanation on the table. And yes, you can still use the qua move to explain and motivate. And
that's exactly right. Sorry, I got
no problem.
All these questions are just so good and so rich, and there are a bunch of issues around them. Yeah, explanation. I mean, anyone who doesn't look and not just look, but actually engage with my book, I had never thought of that. That people might just think I'm just sort of saying, oh, here, just say that. And no, I'm not telling you how to respond to somebody. This is a contribution because it's for those people who are actually trying to get at the truth of the matter.
Yeah.
And this strikes me as a step in that direction.
Yeah.
It was never, and explanation is very much a responsibility when you're trying to get at the truth of something.
Yeah. Well, so finishing up here, you got to come back to talk about the Trinity book as well. There's so many things that I want to ask as well, but so on James Anderson's note, why go further than his macro is merely apparent contradiction resulting from unarticulated equivocation? Why for the lay person, they might say, well, it's a mystery. You know, the creator-creature distinction, they might not even use that word, but he's God and we're not. So there's a mystery there. Why go beyond mystery to affirm contradiction?
Well, any of your viewers who have hung around this long are really seriously after the truth, and so I'm comfortable answering that. Yeah, I think that James Anderson's account is, out of all the consistency-seeking accounts, his is probably better than the rest, largely because it doesn't change the topic. It doesn't sort of, it doesn't look heretical in some, sheep's clothing or whatever, however you want to put it, and so on. And I think it's the closest competitor to the account I advance.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I mean, the two of us, James Anderson and I, agree on all the claims and what's wrong with most of the views out there. At least, I mean, his book was published some time ago, but, I think he would probably largely agree with my criticisms of stuff that have come since. But we both agree that Christ is apparently contradictory, and the ways around that are, if they don't fall into heresy, which all that means in this context is give up the theory altogether.
Yeah.
If they don't fall into heresy, then they just they get complicated, and it looks in decreasingly motivated as the complications and sort of okay. I think we both agree with that. But now, talking of explanation, so Anderson and I both say Christ is an apparently contradictory being. Mm-hmm. And you ask us, well, what's the explanation for the apparent contradiction? I say the reality is contradictory. That's the long and short of it. James Anderson says, no, it's a defect in our epistemic, position, together with this complicated sort of story of God's relation to us. I mean, there's some different stuff that goes on there too. And my comments about the analogical language and all that, I would apply that equally here. I mean, if the ultimate explanation that Anderson gives boils down to that a lot of our language is analogical because there's some equivocations that we miss or something like this, then I think, contrary to appearance, we're actually engaged in different things. I think we're speaking univocally of Christ and univocally of God. It's just that it's hard to it's hard to know how much of the truth we're getting and that sort of thing. But anyway, so my explanation for the apparent contradiction is the reality is contradictory. Anderson's is no, it's, we have this epistemology and we're in this certain epistemic situation and we can't help but see the apparent contradiction but if we could see beyond and get to see where the equivocation falls, then the apparent contradiction would dissolve.
Right.
To me, this is fueled by one and only one thing, and that is a commitment to classical logic.
Yeah.
I simply don't know a good argument for that commitment. And again, I look at it as, is it Christ that's fueling the flight from a contradictory account, or is it an unrelenting commitment to this account of of logic? And I cannot help but think it's the latter.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I wonder. There's this weird theory. I don't know if it's true or not about theories. A theory about the meta theory about theories trickling down from the academy to the popular, parlance and stuff. And so I wonder if 10 years from now, the subclassical logics will come down and all of us will be like, oh, in subclassical, yeah, there was a time where we didn't worry about, or we thought they were evil and now we're okay with them. I wonder if that'll be, maybe your project here will kind of unite theology and philosophy and be kind of a firework there, starting pistol or something. But Dr. Beall, you've been so generous with all your time here. This has been an awesome conversation. I really, really appreciate all your time and letting me pick your brain on all this stuff that you've written entire books and articles on, and then asking me asking you to do that in 5 minutes. And so I really appreciate you stepping on the ledge there and helping me think through this stuff.
Well, it's been a delight. I can tell that you yourself are trying to think hard through it and get to the right spot, and so I'm always happy to talk. I do feel bad. I mean, I can't believe the time, because it feels like we didn't really. There are just so many big things, and some of them kind of unrelated, and so it feels like this long thing. Which, I mean, I loved it, but I'm just thinking, we should, in the future, we'll just pick one topic and it doesn't matter what it is, if it's logic or theology or whatever, but no, awesome. I appreciate it. And I hope that that's been helpful and interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's going to have to do it, folks, for now. But Lord willing, we're going to continue this conversation. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.